A boot scraped across frozen pine boards. A cane tip struck the floor like a second heartbeat. A stained envelope slid under the door and stopped at the toe of an old man's boot. The old man bent down slow. His left leg would not let him bend any other way. He picked up the envelope with fingers that had once pulled triggers and signed warrants, and now mostly trembled in the cold. There was a map drawn inside. There was one line of writing under the map. "Bury him proper, lawman. You owe him that much." The old man read it twice. He read it a third time. He looked at the cane leaning against the doorframe. He looked at the snow falling outside the cracked window. 80 miles of frozen sage country lay between him and that little inked cross. 80 miles for a man whose name he did not know. The old man's name was Josiah Kane, retired United States Marshal. 62 years old. One ruined leg. One promise he had not yet figured out how to break. He folded the letter into his coat pocket. He set the cane. He started for the door. "Stay with me on this one." He had walked into a snowstorm with a hickory cane and a dead man's map. That was the beginning. The town of Cheyenne in the winter of 1879 was not a kind place to old men. The wind came down off the high plains and cut through wool and leather like it had a personal grudge. Josiah Kane lived in a one-room boarding house above a saddler's shop. He paid his rent in cash on the first of every month. He took his meals in a corner of a chop house where the waitress knew not to ask him about the war or the years after. He kept a Colt revolver oiled and loaded in a drawer beside his bed. He had not drawn it in 9 years. The leg had been ruined in 1870. An outlaw named Birch had put a bullet through his thigh during an arrest in a place called Sand Wash. The bone had set wrong. The muscle had wasted. The doctors had told him he was lucky to keep the leg at all. Josiah did not feel particularly lucky. He felt slow. He felt like a horse that had been ridden hard and then turned out to a small pasture to wait. He had served 30 years with a badge on his coat. He had brought in 74 men alive and 11 men dead. He had a small federal pension that paid him just enough to drink coffee and read newspapers and listen to the world get younger and louder without him. When the envelope arrived, he was sitting by the window watching a boy try to chase a stray dog out of an alley. He did not see who slipped it under his door. The hand that drew the map was steady. The line of writing was firm. Whoever had sent it had wanted Josiah to come. Whoever had sent it knew about the leg, knew about the cane, knew about the debt. Josiah read the words again that night by lamplight. "Bury him proper, lawman. You owe him that much." He thought about every man he had buried in his 30 years on the road. He could not place a single one who fit the description in the map. Outside the city, the wind shifted east. Snow began to fall harder. In the morning, Josiah went to the general store and bought hardtack, jerked beef, a small tin of coffee, and a folding shovel. He bought a wool blanket and a bottle of laudanum for the leg. The clerk asked him if he was traveling. Josiah said only, "I am going to do an errand." The clerk did not ask again. He paid for a saddle horse at the livery, but the horse turned skittish in the wind and threw him before he reached the edge of town. Josiah climbed up out of the snow with the cane shaking under his arm. He looked at the horse, and the horse looked at him. He led the animal back to the livery and asked for his money. The man at the desk laughed and said, "You are walking 80 miles on that leg." Josiah said, "I am walking it." He was out of Cheyenne by noon. There was a town called Iron Bluff 30 miles north. Past Iron Bluff, there were only old wagon trails and forgotten claims. Past those, there was the abandoned mining camp of Cold Hollow. Past Cold Hollow, half buried in drifting snow, was the Boot Hill drawn on the map. Josiah walked. The first day he made 12 miles. The second day he made 9. His leg burned at the hip. His shoulder ached from the cane. He slept under a stand of cottonwoods with the wool blanket over his face to keep the snow from melting in his eyes. On the third night, he reached Iron Bluff and took a room over a saloon and lay on the bed without removing his boots. He stared at the ceiling for a long time. He thought about the line on the letter. You owe him that much. He could not remember owing anybody anything. He had paid his debts as he went. He had bought drinks for men he had arrested when the courts let them go. He had sent money to 2 widows whose husbands he had been forced to shoot. He had spent his whole career trying to settle the books so that no one would ever write him a letter like this one. Yet here the letter was, resting on the nightstand under the lamp. He turned the lamp down low. He closed his eyes. He dreamed of a woman with dark hair washing dishes in a kitchen he had not stood in for 40 years. He woke in the cold dark and reached for his cane. In Iron Bluff the next morning, a man at the bar tried to warn him off. The man wore a heavy beard and a buffalo coat. He said, "Old-timer, there is nothing north of here but coyotes and ghosts." Josiah said, "I am looking for a boot hill near Cold Hollow." The bearded man went quiet. He set his glass down very carefully. He said, "Nobody goes to that boot hill." Josiah said, "Why is that?" The bearded man said, "Because the men buried there did not all die natural. And the man who keeps the place does not like visitors." Josiah asked, "There is a man who keeps it." The bearded man said, "There was last anybody saw. Tall fellow. Quiet. He came down once a year for supplies and never spoke a word more than he had to. He paid in old coin. He paid in coin so old it had presidents on it from before the war." Josiah set a few of his own coins on the bar for the drink he had not ordered. He pulled his coat tight. He started north again. Outside Iron Bluff, the trail narrowed to a thread of broken ruts under snow. The sky turned the color of slate. Josiah's leg locked up twice that day, and he had to sit in the lee of a rock and drink a careful sip of laudanum to get it moving again. He kept the letter in the inside pocket of his coat. He kept the map folded against his ribs. He talked to himself sometimes to keep his mind awake. He said the names of every outlaw he could remember. He said the names of every deputy. He said the names of the 2 women he had ever loved. The first he could say easy. A laundress named Mary, dead 20 years of fever. The second name caught in his throat every time. He always said it last and quiet. Eleanor. Eleanor Hart. The girl from St. Joseph, Missouri. The girl he had courted in the summer of 1839, before the badge, before the leg, before any of it. The girl who had vanished from his life in a way he had never fully understood. He did not let himself think about her for long. The wind out there did not allow long thoughts. The wind ate them. On the 5th day, he reached the outer edge of Cold Hollow. The mining camp was a row of leaning timber shacks and a single fallen church. Snow had drifted up to the broken windows. A coyote watched him from a rooftop and then trotted away without making a sound. Half a mile beyond the camp on a slow rise, he saw the wooden crosses. Boot Hill. Maybe 20 markers leaning in the wind. A waist-high stone wall around them, broken in 3 places. The map in Josiah's coat pointed to a grave on the far side of the wall, under a single twisted juniper. He climbed the rise on the cane and on the bad leg, and on something else that had no name. He stopped at the gate of the little graveyard and rested his hand on a cross. He felt the cold of the wood go up his arm and into his chest. He breathed slow. There was no man waiting for him. There was no caretaker. There was no one. Only the wind. Only the markers. Only the juniper bent over a single grave covered in fresh hard snow. Josiah Kane sat on the low stone wall. He took out the laudanum and put the cork back without drinking. He took out his canteen and drank water that was almost frozen at the seal. He listened to nothing. The wind died for a moment. The silence was so deep he could hear the cane creak in his glove. He thought, "This is the quietest place I have ever stood." He thought, "Whoever wrote that letter went to a lot of trouble to send me here for nothing." He thought, "Maybe the man I am supposed to bury is the one already in the ground, and the burying he wants is the kind that only words can do." He thought, "I will speak over the stranger. I will fix the cross. I will go home. He thought all of that. He was wrong about every part of it. The wind picked back up. The juniper trembled. Josiah Kane stood up on his cane. He walked toward the grave under the juniper, and he did not know it yet, but the next thing he would see would unmake every quiet year he thought he had earned. Now here is the thing. The grave was not unmarked. Josiah had assumed it would be, because the map drew it as just a cross with no name. But when he reached the juniper and brushed the snow from the wooden marker, his glove came away with shavings of ice and something else. The cross had been carved. Not painted. Carved deep into the soft pine, the way a man carves when he means a name to last past weather. The snow had hidden the letters, but the cuts were waiting underneath like teeth in a mouth. Josiah leaned on the cane and used the side of his glove, and then the side of his bare hand to clear the marker. Each letter came up dark against the wood. He uncovered the first letter. He uncovered the second. He uncovered the third. His mouth went dry. He did not yet understand what he was reading. He told himself he was reading wrong. He cleared the snow faster. He cleared the whole name. The carved name on the headstone was not the stranger's at all. The carved name on the headstone was Eleanor Hart. Born 1821. Died 1879. Beloved. Josiah Kane sat down in the snow. His cane fell flat. He did not pick it up. The cold did not register at first. His chest had gone hollow in a way it had never gone hollow before, not when he was shot, not when the doctors had talked about taking the leg, not when his old partner had died of pneumonia in his arms in a Kansas City hotel room. Eleanor Hart, the girl from St. Joseph, the girl who had vanished in 1840, the girl he had written letters to for 2 years before the letters started coming back unopened and then stopped coming back at all. The girl whose father had told him that summer he came looking, that Eleanor had married a stage driver and gone west, and please do not ask me anything more, son. Eleanor Hart was here. Under his hand. Under the juniper. 80 miles from a town she had no business knowing. 80 miles from him. Josiah picked up the cane. He used it to lever himself back to his feet. He stared at the carved name until the letters seemed to swim. The wind came up the rise and rattled the crosses. He thought somebody wrote me that letter to bring me here. He thought somebody wanted me to read this name with my own eyes. He thought this is not a debt. This is a confession. This is somebody telling me that everything I have believed about my own life for 40 years was a lie. If you are still with me, hit that subscribe button before this gets worse. It gets worse. Josiah walked back through Cold Hollow in the dying light. He did not stop at the broken church. He did not stop at the fallen well. He walked until he saw smoke. Smoke meant a fire. Fire meant a man. He found the cabin at the back of the camp, set into the slope, half timber and half cut stone. The roof had been mended in the last year with new shakes. A line of split wood ran along the south wall. There was lamplight in the window, dim and yellow. Josiah knocked once. The door opened. A man stood inside. Tall, white hair down to his collar. Eyes pale and clear. A long old coat. A leather belt with a knife on it and no gun. The man looked at Josiah. The man looked at the cane. The man said, "You read it." Josiah said, "I read it." The man stepped aside. "Come in, Marshal," the man said. "You have walked far." The cabin was warm. There was a kettle on a small iron stove. There was a single bed with a blanket folded square at the foot. There was a table. There were 2 chairs. On the wall above the table, there was a small wooden frame. In the frame, there was a photograph. A young woman with dark hair and a high collar. Josiah did not have to walk closer to know who it was. The tall man poured coffee into a tin cup and pushed it across the table. He sat down on the other side. He said, "My name is Caleb Hart. I am her brother." Josiah's hand closed around the cup. He felt the heat through his glove. He did not drink. He said she was buried under that juniper. Caleb said she was. 11 months ago. Josiah said, by you. Caleb said, by me. Josiah said, why am I here? Caleb looked at him a long moment. He said, because she asked me before the end, to make sure that you were the one who put the last shovel of dirt on her grave. She said it was the only way she would rest. Josiah set the cup down. He did not trust his hand on the cup. He said, I have not seen a leaner heart since 1840. I was told she married a stage driver. I was told she went west. Caleb said she did go west. She did not marry a stage driver. Josiah said, then what? Caleb said, she married a man named Tom Birch in 1842 in the territory of Iowa. Josiah stopped breathing. Caleb watched him. Caleb said, the same Tom Birch. The same Birch who put the bullet in your leg, Sand Wash, in 1870. Josiah Kane sat very still in the chair. The kettle ticked on the stove. The wind pushed once at the door and then went quiet. He said, that is not possible. Caleb said, it is more than possible. It is the truth. She did not tell you because by the time you found out who Tom Birch was, she was already afraid of him. She did not write to you because Birch read her letters before they ever left the house. She left him in 1867. She came to me here. She lived 10 years in this cabin. She kept your old photograph in a drawer where Birch could never reach. She died of a lung sickness last spring. She made me promise before she went that I would find you and bring you to her grave. Josiah said, you drew the map. Caleb said, I drew it. Josiah said, the handwriting. Caleb said, mine. She dictated the words. Bury him proper, lawman. You owe him that much. The him was not the stranger. The him was Birch. Josiah's hand went cold on the table. He said, you are telling me that the man I shot at Sand Wash, who shot me back, was her husband. Caleb said he was. Josiah said, you are telling me that for 9 years I have been sitting in a boarding house in Cheyenne thinking my leg was the price of doing my job. Caleb said, your leg was the price of taking back a piece of her from a man who had hurt her every day for 25 years. Josiah said, then she knew. She knew it was me at Sand Wash. Caleb said, she read your name in the Cheyenne paper the next morning. She walked from her chair to the window. She stood at the window for an hour. She did not cry. She said only Josiah Kane. So that is who finished it. She said, so that is who paid for it. She said, I owe him a grave of his own when I have one. Josiah lowered his head. The cane on the floor blurred. The room blurred. He had spent 40 years hating Tom Birch for stealing his leg. He had spent 40 years hating a stranger in St. Joseph for stealing his Alina. He had not understood that the two thefts had been the same theft, by the same man, in the same long crime. He had not understood that the arrest in Sand Wash had not been a piece of bad luck. It had been the last act of his own life, closing a circle he had never been allowed to see. Caleb said, there is more, Marshal. Josiah said, I can hear it. Caleb stood. He went to a small chest at the foot of the bed. He opened it. He took out a tied bundle of letters and an old leather wallet and a folded piece of paper. He set them on the table. He pushed them across. He said, these are yours now. The letters are the ones she wrote and never mailed. The wallet was Birch's. The folded paper is a list. Josiah said, a list of what? Caleb said, every man Birch ever rode with. Every name. Every job. Every place. She kept it for 25 years, hidden in the lining of her dress. She thought maybe one day a lawman would need it. She thought maybe one day the right lawman. Josiah looked down at the folded paper. He did not open it yet. He said, how many names? Caleb said, 41. Josiah said, I arrested 20 of those. I am almost certain. Caleb said, you did. I checked your old warrants in the Cheyenne records. She kept those clippings too. You arrested 21 of the men on this list across 30 years. You shot 4 of them. You never knew why those men came so easy to your hand. Josiah whispered she pointed me. Caleb said she wrote me letters. She told me every few months where Birch's men were going. I sent word to the marshals I trusted. The word always landed at your office in the end. You thought you were a good tracker. You thought you had a nose for them. You did. But you also had a woman in a cabin in Cold Hollow, in love with a man she could not write to, who fed your hunt for 40 years to keep you alive and to keep Birch's men in your hands instead of hers. Josiah Kane began to weep. He had not wept since he was a child. He wept with his hands flat on the table on either side of the bundle of letters. He wept without any sound. Caleb did not move. Caleb led him. When Josiah had quieted, he said, I want to see her. I want to see her grave again, with this in me. Caleb said yes. You should. They went back up the rise in the morning. The sky had cleared. The boot hill was bright with new snow. Josiah carried the folding shovel. Caleb carried a sack of clean earth he had set aside for the spring. The grave under the juniper was undisturbed. The carved cross stood as Josiah had left it. Caleb took out a fresh piece of pine and a small carving knife. He looked at Josiah. He said, there is room on the back of this cross for another name, if you want it. Josiah said, whose name? Caleb said his name. Josiah understood. He said, carve it. Carve Tom Birch on the back of her marker. Carve it small. Carve it so that the cross knows the truth, and the world does not have to. Caleb said, you are sure? Josiah said, he was her husband. He was the man who took my leg. He was the man who, without meaning to, gave me back 40 years of work that mattered. A man like that has a debt at her cross, whether the world likes it or not. Caleb sat down in the snow with the knife. He carved. The cuts were slow and careful. Josiah turned the first shovel of clean earth onto the grave. He turned a second. He turned a third. His leg held. His arm held. He did not need the cane while the shovel was in his hands. He spoke as he worked. He spoke to her quietly. He said, you did better with your 40 years than I did with mine, Alina. He said, you used me without me knowing, and I would let you use me again tomorrow. He said, I am sorry I did not look harder for you in St. Joseph. I am sorry I believed your father. I am sorry I let the badge be the only thing I loved after you. When he ran out of words, he kept working. The sun came over the eastern ridge. The juniper threw a thin shadow across the new earth. Caleb finished the carving on the back of the cross and stood. The two men looked at each other across the small grave. Caleb said, she wanted you to have one more thing. He reached into his coat. He took out a small silver ring. He set it on top of the headstone. He said she wore it on a string around her neck for 40 years. She said it was the one you bought her in St. Joseph. Josiah Kane took the ring. He did not put it on. His knuckles were too swollen now. He closed it inside his palm. He held his palm against the carved name on the cross. He said, thank you, Caleb. Caleb only nodded. Josiah stayed at the grave alone for a long time after that. He talked. He listened. He did not feel watched. He felt accompanied. When he came down the rise, the light had turned. The day was old. The cabin smoked quietly in the camp. He thought I could stay here. He thought no. She would not want me to die in her brother's chair. She got me out of that boarding house once. She is not going to put me in a smaller one. He spent one more night in Caleb's cabin. They did not talk much. They ate cornbread and beans. They drank coffee. Caleb told him about the years she had spent in Cold Hollow. The garden she had kept in summer. The way she sang under her breath when she worked. The way she had laughed only twice in 10 years, both times at her own bad jokes. Josiah listened. He filed every detail in a part of himself that had been empty for 40 years. In the morning, he tied the bundle of letters and the folded list inside his coat, opposite the map. He took the silver ring on a leather thong and hung it around his neck under his shirt. He shook Caleb's hand at the door. Caleb said, "You walked 80 miles for a stranger, Marshal." Josiah said, "I walked 80 miles for the only woman I ever loved, and I did not know it until I got here." Caleb said, "She knew you would come." The walk back to Cheyenne took 11 days. The leg was no better. The leg was no worse. He moved at his own pace through clean white country, and he did not feel slow. He felt like a man who had been carrying a weight without a name for 40 years, and had finally set it down beside a juniper tree. He thought, all that time I was sure I was alone. He thought, all that time I was being watched over from a cabin I did not know existed. He thought, the law had not been the thing that gave my life its shape. She had. He laughed once out loud at that thought. A crow looked up from a snowbank and watched him pass. He reached Cheyenne on a clear afternoon. He climbed the stairs to his room above the saddler's shop. He set the cane in the corner. He sat down on the bed. He took out the bundle of letters and laid them on the pillow. He took out the list and laid it on the table. He took out the ring and held it against the lamp. He sat there until the lamp ran low. Then he stood and walked, on the bad leg and the cane, to the office of the United States Marshal in Cheyenne. He set the list on the chief's desk. He said, "There are 20 men on this paper who are still walking around. I would be obliged if you would let me ride along when you go after them." The chief looked up. The chief said, "Marshal Kane, you have been retired for 9 years. Josiah said, "I have been resting for 9 years. There is a difference." The chief read the list. The chief's face changed as he read. He looked up. He said, "Where did you get this?" Josiah said, "From a woman who kept it for 40 years in the lining of her dress." He said, "From a man named Caleb Hart in a cabin in Cold Hollow." He said, "From the only debt I have ever owed and never knew I owed." The chief folded the list. The chief said, "Sit down, Marshal. We will start in the morning." Josiah sat down. He set the cane across his knees. Outside the window, snow began to fall again, soft this time, almost gentle. He thought of the carved name on a cross under a juniper tree 80 miles north. He thought of a small silver ring warming against his chest. He thought of a woman who had loved him quietly across a continent and a lifetime without ever once being able to say his name out loud. He thought, "You waited long enough, Alina." He thought, "I am still here." He thought, "Let us finish what you started." Outside, the wind moved through Cheyenne like a hand on a closing door. Inside the office, the lamp burned steady. Josiah Kane sat in the chair with the cane across his knees and waited for morning. For the first time in 40 years, he was not waiting alone.